Welcome to this journey into one of the darkest and least remembered tragedies of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we get started, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day or night you've come across this story. Our case begins in 1912 in the quiet little town of Ellsworth Creek, tucked away in the Ozark Hills. What happened there inside the Taney County Courthouse on a cold November morning would be systematically erased from history whispered about for years and eventually banned from textbooks altogether. Locals would later call it simply the Silence, an event that claimed 17 lives. But the chilling part wasn't only the loss of life. It was the careful, deliberate effort to wipe every trace of it from memory. According to a bundle of hidden records uncovered in 1965. During a renovation of the county archives, the massacre occurred on November 12, 1912, during what should have been an ordinary court session. Judge Everett Holcomb was presiding over a land dispute between the powerful Keller family and several local farmers. The courtroom was packed that morning, but by noon 17 people were dead. No gunshots were reported, no screams, not even a struggle. Just silence. Whatever took place in that courthouse has never been explained. The fragments of evidence that did survive hint at something much bigger than a simple act of violence. They suggest a collective decision to erase the truth and bury the town's shame alongside the victims. The Taney County Historical Society has no mention of the event. The local newspapers from November 1912 are missing entirely. Even the cemetery markers from that time are suspicious, with gravestones showing only names, but no dates. It's as if time itself stopped for Ellsworth Creek that day. The mystery first came back to light in 1962, when Professor Martin Whitaker from the University of Missouri stumbled across a series of strange letters in the estate of Harold Keller, grandson of Silas Keller, one of the central figures in the courthouse dispute. Those letters drove Whitaker into a years-long obsession that cost him his career, his family, and perhaps his sanity. The records he discovered have since vanished. Testimonies have been denied. Buildings have been renamed or demolished. All that remains is this fragile account pieced together from fragments of hidden truth. Ellsworth Creek doesn't appear on modern maps anymore. The few people left in nearby towns refuse to acknowledge its existence, and the dirt road leading to its ruins has long been swallowed by the thick Ozark forest. Still, the story survives in scattered documents, private journals, and the haunted memories of those who never forgot. As we step into this concealed tragedy, remember that some doors once opened can never be closed, and some knowledge once gained can never be unlearned. The massacre at the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse isn't only about what happened that November day in 1912. It's also about what happens when a community decides certain truths must stay buried. The Keller family name still carries weight in Taney County today. Their descendants became respected business owners, politicians, and leaders. But none of them have ever spoken publicly about the courthouse or the silence that followed. When this investigation reached her doorstep in 1968, the last surviving Keller of that generation, Margaret Keller Wilson, then 89 years old, offered only one cryptic reply before closing her door. Some silences protect the living, not the dead. And with that, the trail went cold. The story of Ellsworth Creek does not begin with the massacre itself, but with a community already divided, a courthouse built on contested land, and a judge whose loyalties were far from impartial. The true horror of Ellsworth Creek is not just what happened inside the courthouse walls that November morning in 1912, but in what was left undone, the questions never asked, the justice never served, and the truth that was carefully buried. This is the account of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre, the day when silence became the only witness to horror. In the summer of 1912, Ellsworth Creek was a town of just over 2,000 people, tucked in a narrow valley between two Ozark ridges. The community had once boomed briefly during the mining surge of the 1880s before settling into a quieter agricultural life. Main Street held the essentials, the Harmon family's general store, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, Wils's Hardware and Farm Supply, the first bank of Ellsworth Creek, controlled by the Keller family, and the Crown Hotel, a stopover for traveling salesmen and the occasional tourist. The courthouse that would become the site of tragedy had been built only 7 years earlier. County records show the original courthouse burned in 1902 under circumstances deemed accidental, though suspicions lingered. The new building, completed in 1905, stood at the north end of Main Street. Constructed of locally quarried limestone with tall windows and a modest dome, it contained 2 courtrooms, administrative offices, and a basement unusually large for its purpose, officially labeled only as storage and records. Curiously, the courthouse sat on land donated by Silas Keller, patriarch of the county's wealthiest family. According to the deed of transfer signed in March of 1903, the land was given in perpetuity for justice and governance. Yet it carried a peculiar clause stating that, should the property ever cease serving that purpose, ownership would revert back to the Kellers. At the time, the Keller family lived 3 miles outside of town in a sprawling Victorian home on 200 acres of farmland. Silas, then 67, and his wife Eleanor, 58, were the heads of the family. Their sons, James, 42, and Vincent, 38, managed much of the family's timber and mining business. Vincent lived there with his wife Catherine, 29, and their 3 young children. James remained unmarried, a fact that drew quiet speculation in town, especially given his close friendship with Edward Merritt, the county clerk. The Kellers' influence stood in sharp contrast to the families of the Eastern Valley. The Prestons, Caldwells, Hardings, and others, who had settled the region decades earlier and carved out farms ranging from 20 to 80 acres. In the drought-stricken summer of 1912, these families were desperate. Records from Springfield show rainfall was less than half the yearly average between April and August, leaving fields barren and water scarce. Their survival depended on natural springs located on a disputed 400-acre tract along Ellsworth Creek. The farmers argued that this land had been common ground for generations. The Kellers countered with a deed dated 1897, proving they had purchased it from the railroad. Those springs, now more valuable than gold, became the center of the courtroom battle. Presiding over the case was Judge Everett Holcomb, appointed to the bench in 1909, following the sudden death of Judge William Hammond. Official bar records describe Holcomb as competent, but otherwise unremarkable. What they do not reveal, but what local church registries confirm, is that Holcomb's wife Mary was a cousin of Catherine Keller Vincent's young wife. This quiet connection cast a shadow over the trial before it even began. But no official record ever acknowledged the conflict of interest. As the trial date drew near, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The weekly Ellsworth Creek Gazette, long since defunct and with its archives reportedly lost in a 1931 flood, printed only a short note. Tensions remain high. Sheriff Allen has requested additional deputies for the proceedings. What the townspeople could not have known was that this case carried secrets buried far deeper than a simple land dispute. Secrets tied to the old mining camps, to disappearances from the 1890s that were never explained, and to a sealed section of the courthouse basement that on paper didn't even exist. November 12, 1912 broke cold and gray. Records list the temperature at 38 degrees with a light drizzle hanging over the valley. The courthouse was set to open at 8, with testimony to begin at 9. By 7:30, a small crowd was already gathering in the chill, according to the later testimony of Howard Price, the town's only taxi driver. Price's statement, recorded in 1962 but later retracted, described dropping off Vincent Keller and his wife Catherine around 8:15. They didn't look worried, he recalled. Vincent was talking about some new building project, almost excited. Catherine never said a word. She just stared straight ahead. That was the last time I ever saw either of them alive. The clearest record of who was present that morning comes not from official archives, but from the personal papers of court clerk Edward Merritt, discovered after his death in 1954. According to his docket, those inside included Judge Everett Holcomb, Clerk Edward Merritt himself, Sheriff Thomas Allen, with deputies William Davis and Jack Morris, and the attorneys Hugh Blackwood from Springfield representing the Kellers, and Daniel Foster, a local lawyer representing the farming families. The plaintiffs were led by patriarch Silas Keller, while the defendants included Thomas Preston Joseph Caldwell and Elijah Harding. Among the spectators were Vincent and Catherine Keller, James Keller court reporter Margaret Wilson, who would later marry into the Keller family, and roughly 30 townspeople and farmers. Proceedings opened promptly at 9. Attorney Blackwood spoke for nearly 20 minutes, laying out the Keller deed. Foster countered with the farmers' claim of traditional use and long-standing verbal agreements with earlier landholders. The last official entry in Merritt's docket reads 10:17 a.m. Court calls recess following disturbance in gallery. Sheriff Allen addressing situation. What that disturbance was remains unknown. No further entries follow. What is known is that at 12:30 p.m., Samuel Wilson, the town's telegraph operator, wired an urgent message to the sheriff's office in Forsyth assistance required immediately at Ellsworth Creek Courthouse. Situation unclear. No response from local law enforcement. Deputies from Forsyth arrived around 2:15, but found the courthouse doors locked from within. Outside, they encountered a visibly shaken Edward Merritt, who told them, "It's been handled. There's no need for outside involvement." The deputies turned back without entering. No official report was ever filed. No deaths were recorded in the county register that day, despite mounting evidence suggesting otherwise. The first sign that something terrible had indeed occurred came not from the authorities, but from the private diary of Emily Harmon, wife of the general store owner, who wrote simply, "The courthouse bells rang, but no one came out." The diary of Emily Harmon contains one of the few first-hand glimpses into what followed. On November 13, 1912, she wrote only a single line, "Store closed today." George says we're not to speak of it ever. God forgive us all. In the weeks that followed, the Ellsworth Creek Gazette carried on as though nothing had happened. Its pages were filled with routine notices, farm reports, and advertisements. But quietly, businesses like Wils's Hardware, the Crown Hotel, and the Harmon General Store closed their doors without explanation. It wasn't until December 3, 1912, that the Gazette finally broke its silence. In the smallest of notices, it stated, "The case of Keller versus Preston et al. Has been resolved privately to the satisfaction of all parties. The community thanks Judge Adams of Forsyth for temporarily overseeing county matters." Judge Everett Holcomb was never mentioned again. Neither was Sheriff Thomas Allen or his deputies. They simply vanished from the public record, along with several members of the farming families who had stood in that courtroom. The first real evidence of what might have occurred came not from newspapers, but from an expense ledger. In 1963, inside the abandoned Ellsworth Creek Bank, a sealed vault revealed a report dated November 20, 1912. It detailed payments made by Silas Keller to a St. Louis cleaning company, a carpentry firm for courthouse repairs, and large sums to 6 families marked only as settlement in full. Within weeks, life in Ellsworth Creek seemed to resume. A new judge, a new sheriff, and fresh clerks took office. The courthouse reopened, The land dispute was never mentioned again, but in the cemetery, a new row of 17 graves appeared. The markers bore only names, no dates. No funerals were recorded at either of the town's 2 churches. Whatever had happened inside the courthouse, the silence that followed was absolute. By January 1913, just 2 months after the massacre, the Keller family began to reposition itself. Property records show Silas Keller transferred the family home and most of their local holdings to his son James. Vincent's widow, Catherine, left Ellsworth Creek with her children settling in St. Louis, where her maiden name begins to appear in city directories through the 1920s. Silas and his wife Eleanor departed for Europe in February of 1913 aboard the RMS Mauritania. Passenger manifests trace their movements across hotels in London, Paris, and Vienna through 1916, after which their names vanished completely. James Keller remained behind, running the family business. Bank ledgers reveal that under his control, the Kellers shifted their focus away from the Ozarks, investing instead in ventures in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Chicago. By 1920, Ellsworth Creek was little more than a footnote in the family's history. The most revealing glimpse into this period comes from a 1915 letter James wrote to his sister-in-law, Catherine, later discovered among her belongings after her death in 1958. In it, he reassured her, "The arrangement continues to hold. The new judge is amenable to our interests, and the sheriff understands his role perfectly. Edward sends his regards and assures me the basement room remains secured. No one asks questions anymore. I sometimes walk the streets of Ellsworth Creek and wonder how perfectly its people have trained themselves to forget. Perhaps in time I too will learn the trick, though my sleep remains haunted by dreams. Father was right about one thing. Silence does grow easier with practice." In the years after the courthouse incident, the farming families who had stood against the Kellers all but vanished. County records reveal that the Preston farm was sold in December 1912 to a corporation called Ozark Holdings, later exposed as nothing more than a Keller shell company. The Caldwell and Harding lands followed soon after, quietly transferred in early 1913. The most striking change came in 1917, when the creek that gave the town its name was dammed, creating a reservoir that swallowed the disputed bottomland. The project was approved by the county commissioners with no public hearings and financed by unnamed private investors. The resulting Lake Ellsworth drew fishermen and summer tourists, a new attraction, masking the ground it drowned. Meanwhile, the courthouse itself was renovated in 1914. Permit signed by none other than Edward Merritt, now elevated to county administrator, cited basement reinforcements and new ventilation systems. Whatever secrets that building held, they were being carefully buried deeper. Through the 1920s, Ellsworth Creek looked like any small Ozark town. The 1920 census listed 1,273 residents, a decline from before 1912. But not catastrophic. New families moved in, never suspecting what lay hidden beneath their quiet streets. The silence itself had become the town's defining trait, an unspoken pact that certain questions were never to be asked. It was this silence that drew Professor Martin Whittaker to Ellsworth Creek half a century later. In his journal, he wrote, "It's not what they say, but what they refuse to say. Not the stories they tell, but the stories they won't. The absence speaks volumes. Ellsworth Creek doesn't just have secrets. It is a secret." But the silence nearly cracked 2 decades earlier. In the spring of 1934, a 12-year-old girl named Alice Thornton made a startling discovery. Her family had moved to Ellsworth Creek in 1925. And one day, while playing along the shore of Lake Ellsworth during a dry season, she found the water unusually low. Poking around the exposed foundation of an old structure, Alice uncovered a large metal box wedged between the rocks. Inside was a leather-bound journal. The name on the inside cover, Sheriff Thomas Allen, the very man who had disappeared without a trace after the courthouse incident. The journal covered January to November 10th, 1912, just 2 days before the massacre. What it contained was chilling. On October 15th, 1912, Allen wrote, "Merritt showed me what they found in the old mine shaft today. He says the judge already knows. I don't see how we can allow the case to proceed now. But J.K. insists delaying it will only raise more questions. The farmers cannot be allowed access to that land under any circumstances. What lies beneath must remain buried for all our sakes." An earlier entry from September 3rd spoke of escalating threats. Second letter delivered to the Keller house today. This one mentioned bones that speak of betrayal. Vincent is worried someone from the mining days has returned. Silas insists it's farmer intimidation, but I'm not convinced. There's something in the way Preston watches the courthouse when he thinks no one sees him. Terrified, Alice showed the journal to her father, who in turn took it straight to James Keller. According to Alice, her father returned home pale and shaken, telling the family they would be moving to Springfield at once. Within the week, the Thorntons were gone, leaving most of their belongings behind. The journal disappeared as well, until 1958, when it surfaced anonymously in the archives of the University of Missouri. That forgotten journal was what first drew Professor Whitaker to Ellsworth Creek. It was the thread that unraveled the silence. By then, the town was already in slow decline, its secrets preserved under water, stone, and fear. The Great Depression struck Ellsworth Creek with particular force, and by the 1940 census, the population had dropped to just over 1,000. The courthouse, once the pride of the town, was crumbling. Only the first floor remained in use, a shell of the imposing structure it had once been. When James Keller died in 1947, he left no heirs. His will turned over most of the family's remaining properties to the county, except for the parcel containing Lake Ellsworth and a 500-yard buffer around its shores. That land was placed into a private trust with strict instructions that it never be sold or developed. Even stranger was the clause concerning the courthouse. Keller directed that $50,000 be held in perpetuity for its maintenance, with particular attention to the security and preservation of the basement level, which is to remain sealed and accessible only to authorized county personnel. Despite this endowment, the building continued to decay. By 1955, all county offices had been moved to Forsyth, leaving the courthouse abandoned, its windows boarded, and its limestone facade stained and crumbling. Children told stories of eerie sounds coming from within, tales that their parents dismissed, but always with an unusual edge of urgency, as if denial was more than habit, it was duty. Ellsworth Creek might have faded quietly into obscurity if not for what happened in the spring of 1962. That March, the Missouri Highway Department began surveying land for a new state highway just east of town. During soil testing, workers unearthed what appeared to be a mass grave. Dozens of human remains were recovered. The Taney County Sheriff's Office initially treated the site as a crime scene, but within 2 days, the investigation was abruptly shut down when state officials intervened, citing historical significance. The bones were taken to Jefferson City by the State Archaeological Office, and no report was ever issued about their analysis or their final disposition. When later inquiries were made, including by Professor Martin Whitaker, state offices claimed no such records had ever existed. For Whitaker, then a rising history professor at the University of Missouri, the discovery was the spark that pulled him to Ellsworth Creek. He had been researching episodes of civil unrest in rural Missouri when he stumbled across vague, incomplete references to the town. The more he looked, the more he found nothing, missing records, unexplained silences, gaps where history should have been. His journals, recovered after his disappearance in 1968, reveal the growing scope of his obsession. The first entry concerning Ellsworth Creek, dated April 10th, 1962, reads, "Something extraordinary happened in this town 50 years ago. Something the locals still refuse to discuss. I interviewed 7 residents today, all over 70 years old. Each insisted they knew of no unusual events in 1912. Their denials are too perfect, too practiced. One woman, Martha Collins, I believe, rose and walked out as soon as I mentioned the courthouse. Her daughter followed me outside and whispered, 'You should stop asking questions for your own good.' This is no ordinary small-town reticence. This is fear." Whitaker's first real breakthrough came not from town records, but from Edward Merritt's personal papers hidden away in the home of a niece in Kansas City. Edward Merritt, the longtime court clerk who had survived the 1912 massacre, had kept meticulous private records throughout his life, including what appeared to be a coded journal spanning more than 4 decades. Using his wartime background in cryptography, Professor Whitaker spent months painstakingly deciphering the text. What emerged confirmed his suspicions, but also revealed a far more disturbing motive than a simple land dispute. According to Merritt's decoded entries, the roots of the conflict stretched back to the Keller Mining Company's operations in the 1890s. Deep within one of the shafts, miners uncovered something Merritt referred to only as the evidence, or, more ominously, the remains. Whatever it was, this discovery threatened not only the Keller family's legitimacy in the region, but also tied them to crimes dating back to the earliest days of settlement. The disputed land at the heart of the 1912 case, Merritt wrote, provided direct access to the sealed shaft where this evidence had been hidden. The most chilling entry is dated November 13th, 1912, the day after the massacre. It reads, "It is done. 17 souls silenced. The basement has been prepared according to Silas's specifications. Jay agrees no one must ever know what lies beneath both the courthouse and the lake. The judge's wife identified the bodies this morning. The official story has been distributed. God help us all." Later entries reveal Merritt's torment over his role in both the killings and the cover-up. By the 1940s, his writing had grown paranoid. He wrote of being watched, convinced that they will ensure my silence, as they did the others. His final entry, penned just 3 days before his sudden death in 1954, reads, "I can carry this burden no longer. I have prepared my testament and placed it where it will be found when the time is right. The truth of Ellsworth Creek must someday be known, if only so those 17 souls may finally rest." No such testament was ever found. But for Whitaker, the journal pointed to one undeniable conclusion. The massacre had been a calculated elimination of witnesses who had stumbled too close to the secret buried beneath the town. By 1965, Whitaker's investigation had narrowed to a single, inescapable focus: the sealed basement of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse. The building had been abandoned for years. The Keller Trust dissolved ownership, tied up in legal disputes. The structure was rotting, yet its basement remained curiously well protected, secured with modern locks and reinforced doors. That summer, through a connection at the county records office, Whitaker finally gained access. His final journals from August 1965 are unlike the meticulous notes he had kept for years. His handwriting deteriorates across the pages, his once precise observations collapsing into fragments. He described the courthouse basement as containing far more than dusty records or forgotten storage. Behind a rusted coal chute, he discovered what he called a sealed inner chamber. What lay within Whitaker never fully described. His words trail off into scattered sentences marked by agitation and fear. Whatever he saw in that chamber began the descent that would consume him completely. The chamber Whitaker discovered had not been part of the courthouse's original design. Reinforced with concrete and sealed by a steel door, it appeared to have been added years later. According to his notes, Whitaker gained access with keys supplied by his contact at the county office. Inside, he found a bare room no larger than 15 feet square. The only features were a small metal cabinet bolted to the wall and a heavy trap door in the floor. The cabinet contained a leather portfolio embossed with the Keller family crest. Inside were documents stretching back to 1871, the year the first Kellers settled in the region. Among them was a handwritten confession from Augustus Keller, father of Silas, admitting his role in the slaughter of a band of Osage people who had refused to abandon mineral-rich land. Even more disturbing were surveyor's maps marking the locations of not only that massacre, but also a network of unrecorded graves scattered across the Ozarks' burial sites of anyone who had dared to threaten Keller interests over the decades. The trap door led down into a vertical shaft that dropped 30 feet before opening into an abandoned mine tunnel. Whitaker traced the passage toward Lake Ellsworth, its direction suggesting a connection between the courthouse basement and the disputed lands, now submerged beneath the reservoir. His final journal entry, dated August 17, 1965, reads, "What I found at the end of the tunnel exceeds my worst fears. The scale of what the Kellers have done, what they have hidden, is unimaginable. The courthouse massacre was only the most recent act in a century of deliberate violence. But why preserve this chamber? Why not destroy the evidence entirely? Unless they still return here. Unless whatever lies beneath the lake requires their continued attention. I'm going back tomorrow with proper equipment. The truth must be documented whatever the cost." There is no evidence that Whitaker ever returned. On August 18th, a fire of unknown origin tore through the courthouse, collapsing the first floor into the basement. County records dismissed it as accidental, possibly caused by vagrants using the building for shelter. Yet the timing was impossible to ignore. After that night, Whitaker was never the same. Colleagues at the university noted his increasing paranoia, his erratic lectures, and his sudden withdrawal from teaching. By early 1966, he had abandoned campus life entirely, moving into a small cabin near the ruins of Ellsworth Creek. Locals described him as gaunt and restless, obsessed with the lake. He was often seen wading into its waters, collecting samples, recording its levels, and scribbling feverishly into his notebooks. In October 1966, Whitaker submitted a manuscript to the University of Missouri Press. Its title was Silence and Blood: The Hidden History of Ellsworth Creek. The board rejected it, calling the work speculative and unsupported by credible documentation. Humiliated, Whitaker destroyed his only copy. No known version of the manuscript survives. Professor Whitaker's last known communication was a letter to his daughter in St. Louis, dated March 3, 1968. In it, he wrote, "I know now why the town maintains its silence after all these years. It isn't just fear or shame. It's something deeper, something in the water, something in the ground itself. I've traced the connections from the courthouse to the lake to the old Keller estate. They are all connected both underground and metaphorically. What happened in 1912 was only one episode in a pattern that has existed since the first settlers arrived. I must finish this investigation for all our sakes. If you don't hear from me by the end of the month, send the package I left with you to the address enclosed. Tell no one else." The package was never sent. Concerned by the tone of her father's letter, Whitaker's daughter traveled to the Ozarks to check on him, only to find his cabin empty. His journals, photographs, and research materials were gone. The only thing left was a single torn journal page bearing a cryptic note. "The water is rising. They're opening the tunnels again." On April 12, 1968, Martin Whitaker was declared missing. The sheriff's office claimed to have conducted a thorough search, but no trace of the professor was ever found. The case was quietly closed after 2 weeks, with authorities suggesting Whitaker had suffered a breakdown and left voluntarily. It might have ended there, just another missing person, swallowed by the Ozarks, had it not been for the spring floods of 1969. Heavy rain swelled Lake Ellsworth beyond the dam's capacity, flooding the surrounding lowlands and washing out roads and farmland. When the waters receded, they revealed foundations of old structures, long submerged ghosts of the valley that had been drowned half a century earlier. Among them was a yawning mine shaft, its timber supports still visible, despite decades underwater. The Springfield News Leader published a feature on June 2, 1969, under the headline, "Ghosts of Lake Ellsworth." Reporter Robert Hawkins interviewed longtime residents, but found them tight-lipped. When asked about Ellsworth Creek's past, he wrote locals show an unusual reluctance to speak. One elderly man, who would not give his name, said only that some things are better left where they lay underwater and underground. Following the article's publication, Hawkins began receiving anonymous calls and letters. Most were vague fragments of rumor and half-truths. But one package stood apart. Inside were several pages that appeared to have been torn from Edward Merritt's long missing testament. These pages, later turned over to state authorities, provided the most damning account yet of the courthouse massacre. According to Merritt's words, the violence erupted when Thomas Preston confronted Judge Holcomb with proof that the Keller's deed was a forgery. Preston had located original survey markers and records showing the land was communally owned long before the Kellers arrived. Even worse, he claimed to have unearthed human remains while digging a well bones that bore marks of violence which he believed were tied to the disappearance of Osage families in the 1870s. Merritt's testament laid out the final horror in detail. When Thomas Preston confronted the judge with proof that the Keller's deed was a forgery, Judge Holcomb tried to restore order. But Silas Keller only gave a subtle nod. Vincent moved quickly, bolting the courtroom doors shut. Sheriff Allen reached for his weapon, but James Keller already had his pistol drawn. What followed was too precise, too rehearsed to be anything but premeditated. From his coat, Vincent produced a small canister and snapped its seal. A strange mist spilled out, not smoke exactly, but something that clung to the skin, something that seemed to seep directly through the pores. Within moments, those closest to him began to seize. They tried to scream, but no sound came. Whatever was in the mist locked their throats even as their eyes remained wide and aware. 17 people collapsed in that room. The judge, the sheriff, his deputies, the farmers, their families, and even Catherine Keller, who had clearly not been told of the plan. She died alongside them, her gaze fixed in silent shock. Merritt wrote that he watched from behind his desk, powerless, as the courtroom fell still in less than a minute. When it was done, Silas calmly instructed James to open the windows. The mist drifted away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace. Silas turned to Merritt then and said, "Mr. Merritt, your continued employment and your continued existence depend entirely on your discretion regarding today's unfortunate incident. I trust we understand one another." That night, the bodies were taken to the basement chamber that had been prepared beforehand. What happened to them afterward, Merritt did not record, though he hinted darkly that the damming of Ellsworth Creek may have served a more sinister purpose than water supply or tourism. Decades later, when journalist Robert Hawkins published fragments of Merritt's testament in 1969, the investigation ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The Springfield News Leader received a cease and desist order from a powerful St. Louis law firm representing unnamed regional interests. Hawkins was reassigned to sports. His notes and the recovered pages were handed to state police. But when he asked about them 6 months later, he was told they had been misplaced during a reorganization. By year's end, rising waters had once again submerged the foundations beneath Lake Ellsworth. The brief glimpse into the valley's buried history was gone, swallowed up in silence. Authorities posted no trespassing signs around the lake, citing vague environmental concerns. By 1970, Ellsworth Creek had withered to just 86 residents, most of them elderly. The last store closed in 1974. 6 years later, the town was officially unincorporated, its streets and buildings surrendered to the forest. The courthouse ruins were demolished in 1972 under the guise of beautification. The lake remains, though it has been renamed Ozark Memorial Lake, its original identity erased. The Keller family name still circulates in regional business and politics, though no direct descendants remain in the Ozarks. Their wealth was absorbed into foundations and corporations, their origins scrubbed clean through generations of careful management. What truly happened inside the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse on November 12, 1912, may never be fully known. 17 victims erased from records, their graves unmarked, their voices stifled, were silenced by a conspiracy that spanned generations. Yet fragments of their story endure in scattered testimonies, in the reluctant memories of those who dared to whisper, and in the questions that continue to haunt the Ozark Hills. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is not the massacre itself, but the way an entire community agreed to bury it, proving that sometimes silence is the loudest accomplice of all. How does an entire town agree to forget? What price is paid for such a silence? And what happens to that silence when the last person who remembers the truth is gone? In the dense forests that have reclaimed Ellsworth Creek, hikers sometimes speak of unsettling moments when all sound vanishes. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Only silence. Those who keep count say the hush lasts exactly 17 minutes. And then the world exhales again. Local guides scoff, calling it coincidence or nerves. Yet some refuse to lead tours near the old town site, especially in November, when the silence is said to weigh heaviest. The last living witness to the courthouse massacre was Margaret Keller Wilson, once the young court reporter who sat near the judge that fateful morning. She lived until 1971, spared some whispered because of her later marriage into the Keller family. In her final years, slipping into dementia, she murmured to her caregivers about faces that could not scream and a silence that filled the room like smoke. They dismissed it as delirium. But after her death, a sealed envelope was found among her possessions. Its instructions were simple: to be opened when the lake runs dry. Her grandson burned it, unopened, saying only, "Some doors should remain closed. Perhaps those doors will stay shut. Perhaps not." The land remembers what people bury, and water never truly forgets what it covers. In the silence of the Ozark forests, 17 voices wait to be heard. For those who seek the truth of the Ellsworth Creek Courthouse Massacre, a warning silence is not always the absence of sound. Sometimes it is the presence of something else, something that moves and breathes in the empty spaces, something that lingers in the shadows between thoughts. The town that chose to forget may have disappeared, but its silence remains. And silence spreads page by page, whisper by whisper, even now. The Ellsworth Creek story does not end in 1912, nor with Whitaker's disappearance. In fact, every attempt to investigate only seemed to uncover new layers of unease. One of the most chilling accounts came from Harold Jenkins, a former deputy in Tenney County, who served from 1948 until 1962. In an interview recorded in 1967, but never broadcast, Jenkins described an incident during the spring floods of 1952. According to Jenkins, high water had forced the temporary closure of the highway near Lake Ellsworth. He and another deputy were assigned to patrol the area to prevent looting of stranded homes. One evening, as they passed the flooded shoreline, Jenkins saw a wooden beam jutting from the water wedged into the bank. Thinking it was debris, he waded closer. What he found was not driftwood, but the collapsed mouth of a shaft half hidden beneath the waterline. Inside, he swore he heard voices, faint, muffled like people speaking from behind thick walls. At first, he thought survivors had been trapped by the flooding. But when he stepped closer, the voices ceased instantly, and in their place came an oppressive silence that made the air feel heavy. He backed away and reported it to his superior, who told him never to mention it again. The next day, the shaft had disappeared beneath rising water. Jenkins said he never returned to the lake. In the same interview, he admitted he had seen things in town that convinced him the official history of Ellsworth Creek was a lie. He recalled county records, vanishing overnight files taken away in unmarked trucks, and conversations that stopped when he walked into a room. It was like everybody knew, Jenkins said, and they were all just waiting their turn to forget. As the decades passed, folklore layered itself over fact. Local children dared one another to swim to the middle of the lake on November 12th, claiming you could feel hands reaching up from below. Fishermen told of pulling nets heavy with bones, only to be warned to throw them back before sunrise. A few whispered that the silence wasn't natural at all, that it was a kind of toll, a price still being paid. And yet scattered documents and hidden journals suggest that beneath the ghost stories lies a truth darker than myth. Whitaker believed the tunnels beneath the courthouse connected directly to those beneath the Keller estate and possibly beyond. If Merritt's testament is to be trusted, the Kellers used those underground passages for decades, not just to hide bodies, but for something more ritualistic. Survey maps hinted at sites across the region where land was quietly bought, fenced off, and left unused, always near mineral deposits or water sources. And always those lands became tied to sudden disappearances, unsolved murders, or accidents left unexplained. Each generation, the silence of Ellsworth Creek seemed to tighten until the town itself ceased to exist. Its streets vanished under trees. Its courthouse became rubble. Its lake was renamed, its history erased. Yet the silence persists. It surfaces in forgotten documents, in letters hidden in attics, in the memories of those who lived long enough to slip and speak when their minds grew weak. Some believe Whitaker's missing research still exists. That the package he entrusted to his daughter, or perhaps copies he made, remain hidden, waiting to be found. Others claim that what he discovered was too dangerous, too corrosive, and that even if the evidence surfaced, no one would believe it. After all, how does one prove a conspiracy of silence? Perhaps the better question is not whether Ellsworth Creek's secrets can ever be proven, but whether they should. We got a call about something washing up on the shore of Lake Ellsworth, Harold Jenkins recalled. This was during that big flood, when the water rose nearly 15 feet above normal. Sheriff Collins and I drove out, figuring we'd find a deer or some old farm equipment. Jenkins paused for a long 30 seconds before continuing. What we found instead was a metal container. It looked like an old steamer trunk, but built of thick-gauge steel. The flood had ripped it loose from somewhere and pushed it up against a stand of sycamores near the old dam. Inside the trunk was packed with personal effects. Watches, wedding rings, eyeglasses, wallets. Items ordinary people carried with them to court that morning in 1912. Each piece had been carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and labeled with initials. 17 packages in total. When I asked the sheriff what we were going to do with it, Jenkins said he just told me same thing they did in 12. Nothing. They resealed the trunk, loaded it into the cruiser, and drove it not to the county office but to the old Keller estate. Not the house itself, which had long stood abandoned, but a caretaker's cottage, where James Keller's lawyer lived. The lawyer didn't look surprised. He only nodded and had a groundskeeper carry the trunk around back. The next day, Collins warned Jenkins never to speak of it again. It was a county matter Collins told him older than either of us. Jenkins's account revealed more than just a discovery. It exposed the machinery of silence, the way local authorities, even decades later, maintained the cover for the Keller family. It also showed that the 17 victims were not only erased, but stripped of their identities, their belongings preserved as a grotesque inventory of lives extinguished. Evidence of the conspiracy's reach surfaced again in 1963. A retired postmaster from a neighboring town revealed that for decades after the massacre, mail for the Preston Caldwell Harding and other families was still being delivered. The recipient was a post office box registered to the Keller Mining Company. The arrangement had begun in December 1912 and continued until James Keller's death in 1947. Letters were answered in forgeries, money orders cashed, address changes filed. An entire paper trail was manufactured to give the impression that these families had simply moved away. But perhaps the most disturbing revelations come not from paper records, but from the last fragmented notes of Professor Whitaker. His research suggests that what lay beneath Ellsworth Creek was far older and far darker than any family feud or land dispute. Geological surveys from the 1880s described abandoned shafts that produced only modest amounts of lead and zinc. Yet Whitaker uncovered signs that these reports had been falsified. The Kellers, it seemed, had found something else in those depths, something worth killing to conceal. Both Merritt's coded journal and Whitaker's recovered notes made cryptic references to the remains and to ongoing activity in the sealed mines. Midnight excavations, specimens moved under guard, chambers altered and reinforced. Scattered descriptions pointed to something unsettlingly ancient. Pre-Columbian remains unlike any recognized culture. Artifacts with no connection to indigenous design. And most troubling evidence of practices inconsistent with known human societies. The creation of Lake Ellsworth in 1917 begins to look different in this light. On the surface, it was presented as a water project and tourist attraction. In truth, it sealed away access to whatever had been discovered in those shafts. James Keller's will, with its strange clause forbidding sale or development around the lake, reads less like stewardship and more like a permanent quarantine. Even then, the silence was not complete. Locals whispered of strange phenomena at the lake. Fishermen reported unusual currents that tugged their boats toward the center. Campers claimed to hear voices carried on the night air. And always there were the stories of sudden absolute silence 17 minutes long, where the world itself seemed to stop. Reports from the lake over the years speak of strange phenomena. Sudden temperature shifts, low rumbles and hollow knocks rising from beneath the surface. Periods when the water cleared to an unnatural transparency, revealing stone foundations and forgotten timbers that had been hidden for half a century. One fisherman, well into his 80s, swore that on moonless nights the lake gave off a faint glow, a soft luminescence like swamp gas catching fire, except there was no light to catch. Water samples taken by Professor Whitaker and tested at the university lab showed chemical signatures foreign to Ozark streams. Trace amounts of rare earth metals, organic compounds that couldn't be identified at the time. His notes suggest he sent more complete samples to a lab in Chicago, but no record of the results has ever surfaced. The connections between the courthouse massacre and the lake sharpen with every surviving fragment. The land under dispute in 1912 included not only the future reservoir, but also one of the main entrances to the old mining network. Thomas Preston's discovery of bones while digging a well there suggests he may have stumbled onto evidence either of the Kellers' earlier crimes or of something far older. The sealed chamber beneath the courthouse seems to have been more than a hiding place. It functioned as a disposal site for the massacre victims, but also as a hidden gateway to the tunnels leading beneath the valley. Whitaker's descriptions of a shaft running toward the lake imply a deliberately engineered system, one that allowed the Kellers to move undetected between the courthouse, the mine entrances, and the drowned lands. Most unsettling is Merritt's note that the victims were prepared before being moved. The choice of word has fueled speculation that the massacre was not only about silencing dissent, but about supplying something beneath the lake with bodies. If true, the courthouse killings may have been ritual in purpose, their silence not just practical, but essential. In the years after Whitaker vanished, others tried to follow his path. None came as close. A graduate student from St. Louis University reported being shadowed by unmarked vehicles during her 1972 fieldwork and abandoned her thesis. In 1976, a Kansas City journalist claimed his notes were stolen 3 times from his hotel. By 1980, a filmmaker attempting to document the ruins found his cameras repeatedly failed whenever pointed at the lake. He quit the project after a near-fatal car accident weeks later. By the mid-1980s, Ellsworth Creek had been reclaimed by forest. The lake remained managed by a private conservation trust that strictly limited access. The old town site was absorbed into Mark Twain National Forest, with no signposts or plaques acknowledging its existence. County maps erased its name. Regional histories reduced it to a brief line about a small community abandoned during the Depression. The silence had done its work. The erasure was nearly complete. Still, fragments of truth persist in strayed documents, in the hesitant recollections of aging descendants, and in the unnatural hush that clings to the forest around the vanished town. In 1994, an extreme drought lowered Lake Ellsworth to record levels, exposing once more the ghostly foundations beneath the water. A forest ranger on patrol reported finding an opening that appeared to lead directly into the old mine system. Following protocol, he notified the Department of Natural Resources. But when he returned the next day with state officials, the opening had been sealed with freshly poured concrete. No record of the work appeared in county or state logs. When he pressed the matter, the ranger was told the site had been addressed by private landowners with historical claims to subsurface rights. That incident makes clear that even 80 years after the massacre, someone or something still watched over Ellsworth Creek, still guarding its silence. But the question lingers, who continues this work now that the Keller family has long since vanished? The last formal attempt to investigate came in 2002, led by Dr. Eleanor Tanner, a forensic anthropologist studying patterns of violence in rural America. Drawn to Ellsworth Creek by whispers of missing records and unmarked graves, she used ground-penetrating radar to survey the area around the former courthouse. Her preliminary findings, published quietly in an academic journal, identified several anomalies consistent with burial sites roughly a mile from where the courthouse once stood. Before Tanner could begin excavation, however, the land was suddenly purchased by the Ozark Heritage Foundation, a non-profit that quickly declared the site a protected woodland sanctuary where no soil disturbance would be permitted. Later, financial records revealed the foundation's primary funding came from a trust established in the will of Margaret Keller Wilson, the last living witness of the massacre who died in 1971. Tanner's research permits were revoked. Her grant was canceled, and every legal avenue she pursued was blocked by what she later described as institutional resistance at every level. In her final article on the subject, she wrote, "The Ellsworth Creek case is not merely an historical murder mystery. It is a multi-generational conspiracy of silence, maintained through legal maneuvering, economic influence, and perhaps more direct forms of intimidation. What is unclear is why such extraordinary efforts continue nearly a century later, and who exactly is directing them now. That question, who guards the silence, remains the central puzzle. The Keller family, as it once existed, is gone. The town itself has been erased from maps. Nearly every first-hand witness is dead. Yet the machinery of concealment continues to grind on, quietly efficient, unyielding. One theory first suggested in Whitaker's notes is that the Kellers passed their secret upward handing responsibility to a corporation, a government bureau, or a private institution with the power to shield Ellsworth Creek indefinitely. Whitaker speculated that what was uncovered in those mines may have held scientific, historical, or even strategic value far beyond a family's private interest. But there is another possibility, one more unsettling still. Perhaps the silence is not about what was found, but about what was done with it. Both Merritt's testament and Whitaker's scattered notes contain vague but chilling references to experiments, procedures, and continuing operations within the subterranean chambers. If the Kellers were not simply concealing a discovery, but actively exploiting it, then the need for secrecy would not fade with time. It would grow. Perhaps most unsettling of all is Whitaker's final suggestion that the silence of Ellsworth Creek may no longer need protectors. His last journal entries hint that whatever lies beneath the lake possesses its own agency, its own influence, ensuring the silence continues. This could explain why so many investigations collapse, why evidence consistently disappears, and why even the memory of the town seems to dissolve, as if it never existed. In 2008, a hydrological survey of the Ozark watershed recorded anomalies at Lake Ellsworth. Sensors detected water temperatures and chemical profiles that differed sharply from surrounding lakes. More disturbing still, subaudible vibrations pulsed from beneath the lakebed patterns, described by one researcher as nearly linguistic in their rhythm. Before the data could be fully analyzed, the study was abruptly discontinued. The raw files were lost during a server migration, and when a FOIA request was filed years later, the official response stated that no such study had ever been conducted. The centennial of the massacre passed in November 2012 without a word. No marker stands for the 17 who died. No memorial acknowledges the town erased from the record. The only public mention came in an obscure folklore journal, which published an article titled "The Town That Chose to Forget Collective Silence in the Ozarks." One elderly Tenney County resident asked about Ellsworth Creek gave a response that chills even in print. Some silences are just silences, empty spaces where sound should be. But the silence around that place is different. It's full of something that doesn't want to be heard. That difference, that sense of silence as presence rather than absence, may be the truest description of the Ellsworth Creek horror. What happened in 1912 is not only a tragedy buried beneath water and stone, but an act of suppression that seems to live on, shaping the land, the people, and even the memory of what once stood there. Today, visitors will find no trace of Ellsworth Creek on maps. The lake, renamed Ozark Memorial, is listed as a minor recreational site with restricted access. The forest has reclaimed what was once a town. Though sharp eyes can still find its ghostly outlines, a line of trees following the shape of an old street, the faint rectangle of a foundation, the circular sag of a filled-in well. The courthouse itself, once the heart of the community, now lies beneath a grove of oaks, their age suggesting they were planted after the building's demolition. Nothing sets this ground apart from the surrounding forest, save a curious stillness. Birdsong softens. Wind seems to falter. A hush lingers in the air, unnatural heavy. One hiker in 2018 claimed to stumble upon a clearing near this site, where the ground had sunk, exposing what looked like the corner of a stone structure beneath. When he returned the next day with a camera, the depression was gone, filled and smoothed over with fresh soil and pine needles. No storms had passed. No maintenance crews were scheduled. The earth itself seemed to have sealed the breach, and so the last tether to those events may rest with Thomas Keller Wilson, great-grandson of Margaret Keller Wilson and current trustee of the family foundation. His organization still controls several parcels of land around the lake. Beyond that, little is known. Requests for interviews have been declined. Property boundaries remain closely monitored. The silence, it seems, is still being guarded. More than a century has passed since 17 people died in a courthouse without screams. The town is gone, its records erased, its people scattered. Yet the silence endures an active force, waiting, watching, filling the void where truth should be. And in that silence, perhaps the voices of Ellsworth Creek are not gone at all. They are only waiting to be heard. Now, in his 70s, Thomas Keller Wilson has consistently refused interviews regarding his family's past. Public records confirm that he returns to the Ozarks only once a year for exactly 3 days before resuming his life in Boston. The timing of his visits is always the same, mid-November, aligned with the anniversary of the courthouse massacre. Locals who have encountered him note that he travels with sealed cases of specialized equipment. What they contain has never been identified. Each year, he makes his way to the lake at night alone, carrying what observers describe as a small offering, something resembling flowers, though not quite. Whatever ritual Wilson enacts by the water's edge, it appears to fulfill a duty passed down through blood and time, a final tether binding the Keller line to whatever stirs beneath Ellsworth Creek. The silence endures. The secret remains intact. And the 17 victims lie unmourned, remembered only by those who have painstakingly reassembled this broken history. For investigators who have tried to follow the trail, a troubling pattern emerges. At first there is curiosity, then comes obsession, soon after paranoia, and finally either abandonment or disappearance. Those who persist describe the uncanny sensation of being watched not merely by human agents guarding a secret, but by something less definable, a pressure on the mind itself. One researcher, before abruptly abandoning his work, confessed in a final note, "It isn't that I'm being threatened. It's that I'm being persuaded that some questions should not be asked, that some doors should remain closed." What terrifies me is how reasonable this begins to feel. How the silence itself begins to seem protective rather than concealing. This psychological dimension may be the most insidious aspect of the Ellsworth Creek case. The silence does not simply cover the truth, it replicates itself in those who touch it, a contagion of complicity passed along like an inheritance. To investigate is to risk not only external suppression, but internal surrender to the very force one seeks to expose. The final testimony concerning Ellsworth Creek comes not from scholars or journalists, but from a hospice nurse who tended to Thomas Keller Wilson in his last days in 2022. According to her account shared anonymously with a regional historical society, Wilson grew increasingly agitated as the end drew near. In his final hours, he muttered over and over about the obligation and the feeding. In his final lucid moment, Thomas Keller, Wilson is said to have grasped the nurse's hand and whispered, "It's hungry again, always hungry. But there's no one left to feed it now. Listen for the silence. When it stops, that's when you should worry. When the silence stops, it means it's found another way out." He died before explaining those cryptic words. His body was cremated immediately following instructions outlined in his will. The nurse who reported his last statement resigned from her position shortly afterward and disappeared from public record. The Wilson Family Trust, which had overseen the lake property for decades, was dissolved after his death. Ownership of the land passed to a newly formed entity, the Ozark Ecological Research Consortium. Within months, the consortium began construction of a research facility on the lakeshore. Satellite imagery shows a stark, windowless concrete structure with deep underground components and a security perimeter more suited to a military site than an ecological station. No public announcements have ever been made about its purpose. Employment records suggest most of its staff are brought in from out of state, and deliveries to the site occur almost exclusively at night. Meanwhile, hydrologists monitoring the watershed have reported a steady decline in Lake Ellsworth's water level, even during years of normal rainfall. If the trend continues, large sections of the lake bed could be exposed within 5 years. Whatever has been hidden beneath the waters for more than a century may yet surface. Whether this revelation will finally provide answers or unleash something far worse remains unknown. The silence of Ellsworth Creek has endured for over 100 years, maintained through power, fear, and perhaps something more than human. But no silence lasts forever. For those who seek the truth about what happened in that courthouse in 1912, and what still lingers in the drowned valley, a warning. Some investigations change more than history. Some secrets once uncovered cannot be buried again. And some silences once broken release things that cannot be silenced again. Ellsworth Creek may have vanished from maps. Its courthouse lies in ruins, its graves unmarked, its story erased. Yet the legacy remains in sealed records, in stolen artifacts, in the waters of a lake that should not exist, and in the heavy unnatural quiet that still cloaks the woods. If you ever find yourself there, listen carefully, because the silence speaks. 17 voices waiting for justice, and perhaps something else waiting beneath the waters, patient and hungry in the dark. The truth of Ellsworth Creek is not dead. It is waiting in silence.